A team enters Criss Angel's private mansion for one specific reason: to investigate a sealed-off section of the home that even longtime staff weren't allowed into. They expect props, illusions, maybe rare artifacts. What they actually find is something that forces them to call for backup: a hidden wing, a room without windows, and a collection of items so disturbing that the network refuses to air the raw footage. Before we begin, subscribe for more shocking investigations. Criss Angel's mansion had always been rumored to contain rooms no outsider had ever seen. Areas even longtime staff whispered about, but never dared to enter. But the chain of events that finally brought investigators inside began with something far more urgent than curiosity. For several days, the mansion's internal monitoring system logged unusual activity in the lower level. Doors opening on their own, motion sensors triggered in rooms that were supposed to be sealed, and a blackout in one wing that the property's electrician described as mechanically impossible. When Criss himself failed to respond to multiple check-ins from his management team, concerns escalated quickly. Some believed he had simply gone into one of his creative disappearances, isolating himself to develop a new illusion. But others, people who had worked closely with him for years, felt something was wrong. His assistant finally made the call to escalate. She reported hearing a loud metallic crash over the phone before the line went silent. A wellness team and private security were dispatched immediately. When they arrived, the mansion was strangely quiet. No alarms blaring, no signs of forced entry. But the front door, normally locked by biometric access, was standing slightly open, as if someone had exited in a hurry, or hadn't bothered to close it at all. As the investigators stepped inside, the first thing they noticed was the temperature. The house was cold, much colder than the thermostat displayed. Personal items were left out on tables, lights were on in rooms Criss rarely used, and a faint electrical hum echoed somewhere deeper within the home. The team began sweeping the ground floor, expecting to find a simple malfunction or maybe a creative mess left behind by Criss during a late-night brainstorm session. But the deeper they moved into the mansion, the more obvious it became that something inside was intentionally hidden. Several hallways displayed fresh scuff marks, as if heavy objects had been dragged. One door, the only one in the mansion with both a digital lock and a physical deadbolt, was warm to the touch, despite the rest of the house being freezing. A technician running a thermal scan paused and whispered, "There's movement behind that wall, but not anything shaped like a person." This was the moment the team realized they were no longer dealing with a routine welfare check. Something inside Criss Angel's mansion had been deliberately concealed, and whatever it was still active. From the outside, Criss Angel's mansion appeared sleek, modern, and meticulously designed, an extension of his persona as a master illusionist. But once investigators crossed deeper into the interior, they realized the blueprints they had been given barely scratched the surface of what the home actually contained. Certain hallways extended farther than the layout suggested. Others ended abruptly, as though entire rooms had once existed, but were purposely removed from official documentation. Even the walls felt strange, thicker than standard construction, almost as if additional chambers were hidden inside them. The first major red flag appeared in the east corridor. According to the blueprint, it should have led to a single guest room and a small storage closet. Instead, investigators found 3 doors, none of which matched the layout. The first door led to a dead-end hallway with seamless walls, as if an old entrance had been sealed and plastered over. The second door was locked with an industrial-grade magnetic system, one far beyond what a homeowner would typically install. But it was the third door that shifted the entire tone of the investigation. Behind it sat a narrow passage lined with soundproof padding, the type used in high-security recording studios or psychological testing environments. A faint buzzing echoed through it, electrical, rhythmic, controlled. The deeper they walked, the more the air seemed to thicken. It became clear this part of the mansion was intentionally insulated from the rest of the home, as if it were meant to contain something or prevent something from escaping. As they continued exploring, the team found more architectural anomalies. Vents that led nowhere, support beams installed at strange angles, false ceilings with just enough space for a person to crawl through. A structural engineer on the scene whispered, "This isn't random. This is built like a maze, with purpose." A sense of unease settled on the group. Criss Angel had always been known for misdirection and deception on stage, but this mansion suggested something far deeper. Layers of secrecy woven into the very architecture. Rooms were designed not just to hide illusions, but to control environments, manipulate sound, and distort perception. A motion sensor suddenly flickered to life in a hallway that, according to every blueprint, shouldn't have existed. Investigators froze as a door at the far end slowly creaked open on its own, revealing total darkness beyond. Nothing about the mansion's layout was accidental. It felt engineered, intentionally confusing, intentionally misleading, intentionally concealed. And the further they went, the more it became clear. This house wasn't built for living. It was built for hiding something. The investigators entered the first concealed room expecting to find stage props or high-end equipment. After all, Criss Angel's performances had always relied on elaborate mechanics and cutting-edge technology. But what they uncovered inside went far beyond standard illusion design. The air in the room was still, heavy, and unusually cold, as though the entire space hadn't been disturbed in years. Yet the dust patterns suggested someone had been in here recently. The walls were lined with shelves overflowing with unfinished prototypes, each tagged with handwritten notes in Criss's unmistakable, sharp handwriting. One device resembled a skeletal exosuit made of lightweight titanium, connected to wires and pulleys designed to simulate levitation without visible support. Another appeared to be a segmented mechanical cage with rotating panels, something that might have been intended for a teleportation illusion, but looked far too dangerous to ever use on stage. But it was the large wooden table at the center of the room that stopped the investigators cold. Laid out carefully were several journals and sketches detailing illusions Criss had never performed publicly, concepts that pushed the boundaries of physical endurance, sensory manipulation, and psychological control. One entry described a fear immersion apparatus designed to overwhelm a participant's senses to the point of hallucination. Another detailed a zero-light chamber, a room engineered to trap the subject in pitch-black darkness until their mind began creating its own visual stimuli. One prototype in particular drew concern, a helmet-like device wired to a harness system, with notes explaining how it could simulate out-of-body sensations by altering auditory and visual perception. Mentalists often warn that such experiments can cause lingering psychological effects, but Criss seemed determined to master it. A small cabinet in the corner held even more disturbing items: old medical-grade restraints, broken mirrors, a tangle of wires leading to a rig that, according to the notes, was meant to rapidly rotate a person in complete darkness for consciousness disorientation testing. Even seasoned investigators felt unsettled. These weren't props, they were experiments, attempts to manipulate the mind itself. Then they found the blueprint. A massive sketch taped to the wall detailed a subterranean floor plan that did not match any known structure in the house. Underlined in thick black ink was a phrase repeated multiple times: "The lower level must remain sealed." The discovery made one thing painfully clear: this first room wasn't the main secret. It was only the preparation. Whatever Criss was truly hiding was deeper inside the mansion. The investigators had barely begun analyzing the strange devices in the first hidden room when one team member noticed something odd: a draft of cold air leaking from behind a bookshelf that, according to the mansion's design, should have been set firmly into the wall. But the shelf wasn't flush. There was the faintest gap along the right side, and dust patterns on the floor revealed a curved arc, as if the shelf had been moved recently. One investigator pressed gently against the wood. Nothing happened. Another scanned the edges with a flashlight until the beam caught a tiny metallic glint, a concealed latch tucked beneath a row of untouched books. When they triggered it, the entire bookcase shifted with a low mechanical groan, swinging outward like a vault door and revealing a narrow staircase spiraling into darkness. The temperature dropped instantly. This wasn't a typical basement staircase. The walls were lined with heavy soundproofing foam, and each step was reinforced with steel, indicating the staircase wasn't just hidden, it was fortified. The deeper they went, the more oppressive the air became. Something about the descent felt deliberate, almost ritualistic. Every few steps, faint metallic clicks echoed from below, as if machinery were idling somewhere in the unseen depths. Halfway down, one investigator whispered, "This wasn't built with the rest of the house." He was right. The materials, construction style, and acoustics felt entirely different, older, heavier, and more industrial. This wasn't designed for showmanship. It was built for secrecy. At the bottom of the stairs, they found a reinforced steel door slightly ajar, a single strip of light glowing from the room beyond. The hinges showed signs of recent use. Someone had been here very recently. As they pushed the door open, the investigators realized they were stepping into a part of Criss Angel's world that no fan, no producer, and not even his closest collaborators were ever supposed to see. Something down here was alive, with purpose. The steel door creaked open into a cavernous underground chamber, the air thick with the smell of cold metal and machine oil. The investigators paused at the threshold, momentarily stunned by the sheer scale of the space. This wasn't a basement or a simple workshop. It was a full-blown experimental facility, one that no magician, no matter how ambitious, should ever have needed. The first thing they noticed were the mirrors, dozens of them, tall, rectangular, and arranged in a perfect circle around the center of the room. But these weren't normal mirrors. The glass had a faint metallic sheen, and some reflected the investigators at a fraction of their true size, while others warped their shapes entirely. These were optical devices designed for advanced illusion experiments. Yet what they created wasn't the typical misdirection Criss Angel was famous for. It was disorientation on a psychological level. In the exact middle of the mirrored circle stood something massive, hidden beneath a black industrial tarp. The floor beneath it was scuffed in a perfect ring, suggesting the object underneath had been rotated or tested repeatedly. When investigators pulled back a corner of the tarp, they saw a mechanical platform fitted with restraints, pulleys, and a gyroscopic rig designed to spin and elevate a person in total darkness. This wasn't a stage illusion. It was a sensory deprivation device engineered to push the human mind to its breaking point. Scattered around the room were sketches and diagrams of illusions Criss had never performed publicly. One blueprint, labeled Project Eclipse, described a stunt involving the shutting down of multiple senses at once. Another, titled The Void, depicted a person suspended in a weightless environment, surrounded only by reflective surfaces, an experiment meant to distort time perception. But the most disturbing discovery sat on a small rolling cart near the back of the room, a set of medical monitoring devices wired into the gyroscopic platform, heart rate sensors, neurological scanners, and a handwritten chart listing dates and test results, all belonging to Criss himself. He wasn't testing these machines on assistants or volunteers. He was testing them on his own body. Near the far wall, they found a large whiteboard covered in frantic handwriting. Phrases like, "Need to go deeper. Fear is the final boundary. Mind must be separated from environment." Whatever Criss Angel was doing in this underground room, it was no illusion. It was an obsession, one that pushed him far beyond the limits of safe performance. And yet, something about the chamber felt incomplete. One investigator noticed a faint glow coming from a narrow hallway on the right side, an area not shown in the sketches they had already found. It appeared Criss had built a second hidden space, one even more secret than this. The narrow hallway led to a smaller chamber, bare, silent, and lit only by a single hanging bulb that flickered with each step the investigators took. In the center of the floor sat something completely out of place in an illusionist's workshop, a heavy, industrial-grade safe bolted directly into the concrete. This wasn't for valuables, it was for containment. The safe door showed scratches near the lock, as if it had been opened and closed in a hurry. When investigators finally breached it, they didn't find money, jewelry, or high-end props. Instead, the contents revealed a disturbing shift in Criss Angel's priorities long before anyone realized something was wrong. Inside were medical documents, neatly stacked and marked with dates that aligned with his most dangerous performances. But these weren't routine checkups. They detailed episodes of fainting, disorientation, hallucinations, and unexplained neurological anomalies. Notes from private doctors warned him repeatedly to discontinue high-stress sensory experiments. One report stated plainly, "Mental strain exceeding tolerable limits. Recommend immediate cessation." He ignored them. Folded beside the reports were letters, handwritten, tense, and emotional. Former assistants begged him to stop pushing himself into extreme isolation tests. One letter described a night when Criss was found unresponsive in the underground chamber, his heartbeat irregular, his breathing shallow. Another warned him that the sensory machinery he built could cause permanent psychological damage. The most jarring discovery lay in a sealed envelope labeled "Do not open during recovery." Inside was a page torn from a notebook, covered in frantic scribbles. "I saw myself. It wasn't me. The mirrors aren't reflecting. They're responding." Something stayed when the experiment ended. This wasn't showmanship. These were the writings of someone standing on the edge of a psychological break. As investigators closed the safe, a chilling realization settled over the room. Criss hadn't been hiding props or illusions. He had been hiding the consequences of his own obsession, the toll it was taking on his body, his mind, and possibly something far stranger. There was still one more room ahead, and according to the notes they found, it was the one he feared the most. At the back of the chamber, next to a stack of abandoned equipment, investigators found a small locked case, far newer than everything else in the room. Inside were 3 identical flash drives, each labeled only with a date and a single word: test. These weren't production drives or rehearsal clips. They were private recordings Criss had made of his experiments. Experiments no network ever approved and no audience was ever meant to witness. When the investigators loaded the first drive onto a secure laptop, the room fell silent. The screen showed the underground chamber, the same mirrored circle, the same mechanical platform. But this time, Criss Angel stood in the center of it, alone. He strapped himself in, adjusted a headset, and activated the machine. The rig began to rotate slowly, then faster, the mirrors around him distorting his reflection into a dozen impossible versions of himself. At first, he appeared calm, breathing steadily, eyes focused. But as the rotation intensified, the footage captured something unsettling. Criss began reacting to things not shown in the video. He flinched at empty corners, reached out toward reflections that weren't mimicking his movements, and muttered incoherently, as if responding to someone in the room. Halfway through the recording, he suddenly screamed for the rig to stop. But the machine kept spinning. The camera shook violently, as if the room itself had shifted. A sharp audio distortion cut through the speakers, a growling metallic resonance that didn't match any known mechanical sound. Investigators watching the clip felt their skin crawl as the camera flickered, revealing a distorted silhouette standing behind Criss, a figure that vanished the instant the frame corrected. The video ended abruptly with a loud crash, and the image of Criss collapsing to the floor. The second drive was even worse. By the third, investigators refused to continue. One technician turned away from the screen, pale, whispering he wasn't alone in those tests. Something else was there. The network later reviewed the footage and immediately classified it as unbroadcastable, not just because of safety concerns, but because no one could explain what appeared in the final frames. Whatever Criss encountered in that mirrored chamber was not a trick, and the footage proved it. Following the discovery of the flash drives, investigators pressed deeper into the far hallway, one narrow, dim corridor that did not appear on any blueprint and seemed to grow colder the farther they walked. They reached a small door with no handle, only a faint indentation where countless fingertips had pushed it open before. When they applied pressure, the door shifted inward, revealing a room unlike anything else in the mansion. The space was small, windowless, and eerily silent. The walls were lined with chalk markings, symbols, spirals, and geometric patterns that didn't match any stage notes notes or illusion diagrams. In the center of the floor was a large circular design drawn in thick black charcoal, surrounded by melted candle wax pooled into hardened rivers. The wax trails suggested the candles had burned violently, some even exploding outward rather than simply melting. A journal lay open near the center, its pages filled with frantic handwriting. These weren't notes for a performance. They read like confessions written during moments of fear or clarity. Phrases stood out immediately. The chamber intensified it. Reflections aren't reflections. The presence returns when I disconnect. Investigators realized this was Criss Angel's private meditation and experimentation room, a space he used not to practice illusions, but to recover from whatever he believed he was encountering in the mirrored chamber. One page described a sensation of being watched long after the machine had shut down. Another recounted a moment where he saw a second shadow trailing behind him, even though he stood under a single light source. Then came the most disturbing entry. I can't tell if I'm losing myself or if something else is taking my place. The room felt charged, as if filled with static electricity. Every investigator reported feeling pressure in their chest, a heaviness that lifted only once they stepped back into the hallway. Whatever Criss had been doing here, it was pushing him psychologically, and perhaps neurologically, past the breaking point. When the investigation team regrouped upstairs, the decision became clear. This wasn't a home. It was a labyrinth built around an obsession, one that had spiraled into dangerous territory. Between the sensory rig machinery, the medical reports, the escalating hallucinations, and the symbolic chamber, it was obvious that Criss had been conducting experiments far beyond the realm of illusion. His team contacted his representatives, who consulted medical professionals and legal authorities. Within hours, the mansion was declared a hazardous psychological environment. Several rooms, including the underground chamber, were sealed off under safety protocols. The mirrored rig was dismantled and removed. All footage, journals, and experimental devices were placed under strict security to prevent unauthorized release. Criss Angel issued only a short, controlled statement afterward. I was exploring the limits of perception. I went too far. But those who saw the underground rooms and the footage from the flash drives knew the truth was much darker. Criss wasn't just testing illusions, he was testing himself, pushing his mind until it fractured. And somewhere within that maze of mirrors and symbols, something pushed back. To this day, the mansion remains sealed. Rumors say Criss never returned, and those who entered on that final investigation insist the deeper chambers felt wrong in a way they still cannot explain. Whatever they found inside his mansion didn't just shock them. It convinced them that some illusions are never meant to be explored alone.